There we go. Hello and welcome to SWP Tips Part 3. Today we are focusing on creating the implementation plan. This is a part of the MS4 permit, minimum control number 1, and we will talk about how to do it, what to think about, and how to create this plan. My name is Nick Voss, and I am from the Bad Lake Area Water Management Organization. I have 2 co-presenters here, which will introduce themselves as well.
I'm Lauren Hazenson. I'm the Communications and Outreach Coordinator at Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed District.
And I'm Molly Nelson. I am a watershed technician and water resource specialist over at Rice Creek Watershed District.
Great. And this PowerPoint is available by request. As you'll notice that there are tools and planning resources right here in the PowerPoint itself. Like I mentioned, this is part of minimum control number 1, public education and outreach. The MS4 permit asks for implementation plan that developed and consists of the following. So these are the things that we're going to put together into the draft hypothetical plan. These 4 points: target audience and measurable goals, staff responsible for the implementation, specific activities and schedules to meet measurable goals, description of coordination with education partners, if applicable, and an annual evaluation of those measurable goals. And right up front, the most important thing I can encourage everybody who's doing this planning to think about is that it's designed to be able to be realistic and within your parameters. Just because it might sound intimidating, it might sound like it needs to be extravagant, but we're going to break this down so that the goal is really to make it fit and make it doable. But there's more that this benefits beyond the SWP report itself. The SWP touches on the issues that are already common around cities and townships. Calls and complaints when things arise where there's something unexpected. This plan will provide a point of reference and a tool to say, like, here's what you're doing and you've got your ducks in a row. It's helpful for public transparency and accountability, tangible talking points and presentation tools for your city council. If you're doing that annual MS4 required meeting where you update and present to the city what you're doing, this is a way to make it so it's already there, it's already exists. Takes the Lone Ranger dynamic and creates a team. It allows for planning ahead to streamline and double dip different goals, different strategies, all these things that are already happening in your municipality. Just makes it so that you can double dip on those. Easy MS4 compliance without the crunch time. Okay, and I'll switch over to Molly.
Yeah, all right, thank you, Nick. So when you're creating your implementation plan, a lot of us are pretty familiar with sometimes you may have done winging it in the past where you didn't set up a plan, you knew what needed to get done, but you didn't have a flow with what you were doing. And the issue with winging it, as we may have discovered in the past, that will create some failure with your project. It makes it harder for you, and it also makes it harder for whatever partners you're working with to get to that deliverable goal that you're looking for. And in the end, it will create a lot of confusion and fatigue with the process, and it just doesn't make it a great experience overall. And so we've kind of created a little analogy for you. Kind of imagine when you're planning for your public education and outreach, think of it as a race, or in this case, to take away that competitive edge to it, think of it as like a fun run or something like that, maybe like a turkey trot. If you prepare for the run, so say you've trained, you've stretched, you've come with the right clothing, maybe you've set up someone along the way to give you water, you're more guaranteed to get to the finish line in the way that you want it to go. You're more guaranteed to maybe have a personal record or maybe even get first or second place. And that's when you have that good flow with your project implementation plan. But if you're unprepared, if you're winging it, you didn't stretch, you didn't eat before, then you're more susceptible to maybe getting injured or dropping out of the race. And if some unknown obstacle comes in the way, like a hurdle of some sort, you might fall and get hurt, and then you might not finish in the way that you wanted to. So think of that when you're planning your project implementation in that same way. So we know all of our aspects that we're trying to cover. You know, we're trying to find our target audiences, create those measurable goals, define activities, create that part, or coordinate with different partners and create the activity schedule. That is what we need to do to get to where we want to go. But if it's all over the place, some things might be forgotten to be done, and we might not get to where we want to go. So it's just not a great way to approach your implementation. So on the next slide, we created this template to design your plan with the flow in mind. So you have all of the different aspects that you're working with, but there's a flow to it now, so that every time you have that consistency to get to that outcome that you want, and to ensure that everything goes smoothly for the partners that you're working with, and to make sure that you get to where you want to go. So this is kind of going to be a little activity that I'm going to present to you in Zoom. We have the option to annotate. So I'm just going to annotate here that process of going through that flow to get to your outcome. And for the purpose of this presentation, it's going to be light. When you're actually utilizing this strategy, you can go into as much detail and as depth as you want to go. But when you're approaching a project, you say you want to think of your target audience. You know, who are we trying to reach out to? So in this case, maybe we'll do local businesses. And so that's going to be our target audience. And I'm going to move this so it fits in the box a little better. Just kidding. It's a little bit outside the box, but that's okay. It's always good to think outside of the box, right? So then we're going to define our measurable goals. So how many businesses do we want to ensure that we get outreach to? And I'm just going to say, for the sake, we want to reach out to 10 businesses and ensure that we have engagement from 10 different local businesses. And then here you will define different activities to make sure that we get outreach to these businesses. So for example, maybe you want to do a summer social media series to get that engagement, get that education and outreach out there. So summer social media series. And then down here, you can see that we've identified the staff that would be responsible for this. So for example, it might be your social media manager. If you don't have a social media manager, maybe just whoever's in charge of communication and outreach. And then we want to define a set schedule. So we want to have those parameters of a timeline for ourselves so that we ensure that we get it done within a certain time frame that works for everyone. So as I mentioned, this is a summer series. So maybe we'll do May through August. And then we want to identify who we are coordinating with as a partner, who can help boost this experience, who can provide those resources that can make this even better for getting outreach to those businesses. So maybe we'll think of reaching out to our local watershed district, because watershed districts tend to have a lot of great resources to use. For example, like at Rice Creek, we have like a roots display. We have different social media, I guess, like deliverables, like different graphics to use. So they might be able to provide like smart salting graphics. Oh, that's winter, so maybe we're not thinking about. Let's do turf alternative. Oh, we'll just do social media graphics. We'll keep it simple, not specific. And so that's what they can provide and what we can use to make sure that we get to our deliverable here. Nick, I think next slide, perhaps. There we go. So I like this here. You know, we have our hurdles might show up throughout the process, but they're smaller and easier to get over. And then when you design for flow, you are more likely to get to the finish line successfully and in the way that you want to meet those MS4 requirements. And it builds those partnerships with who you're working with and ensures that they want to work with you in the future and that you get your outreach to your targeted audience. And I think we have an incoming meme. Yes. So when you design with the flow, that ensures that you get that feeling of crossing the finish line successfully. And so I'm going to hand it off here. We're going to talk about those targeted audiences.
All right, thanks, Molly. So one of those hurdles can absolutely be your scope, the scope of the project, and overestimating the amount of reach you're going to have for your initial project, or maybe shooting for the stars very early on. So we're going to talk about how you can kind of have SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound goals. And the first way to do that, to start with this plan, is really to talk about that first box, the target audience. So when we talk about target audience, we're not talking about everybody in your specific city or your specific overall geographic area. That's going to be way too broad. It's also might include people that you haven't worked with previously. You may not have enough information about that particular audience to know how they would engage with you necessarily. So it's really helpful to just kind of start small and start achievable, work smarter, not harder in terms of these target audiences. So some questions to ask yourself is, who have you worked with in the past year? Are there some relationships that you started to develop? Are there some partnerships that you've started to develop with particular audiences in the community that you can kind of leverage? Who would you like to reach more that you haven't? So maybe you've done a little bit of research about a certain demographic in the community that you'd really like to reach better, and you just haven't had the time or the opportunity to do so. So this is a great opportunity to do that. And again, one size fits all in terms of target audiences isn't necessarily realistic. Families are going to be looking at something completely different than local businesses, for example. So in terms of crafting those messages and that education material, you want to make sure that you keep that specific targeted audience in mind. And we have a couple of examples of that. So this is a whole list. You have homeowners associations, lake associations, businesses, multifamily units, religious groups, cultural groups. You may have specific events that you already have in the community. You're noticing that certain subsections go to those particular events. So these are all the types of specific audiences that you can target. So if you're doing shoreline restoration education, you might do lake associations, for example. So we're going to move to that next box, which is looking at our specific measurable goals. So one thing that you can do is you can reach out to your partners right away when you're drafting those goals. And of course, one of your major partners are going to be the soil and water conservation districts and your watershed districts. So you can ask, are there some BMPs that are being installed? Are there some TMDL reduction targets in your area? What are the watershed level goals? So some examples of that is, we're looking at 40 pounds of total phosphorus reduction in Lake Wobegon. So that's a general external goal for the watershed. And then you can consult your watershed organization for some activities, studies, project targets. And so you already have a framework in place in that particular example. This is an opportunity for you. We're not saying this is something that you need to do. This is a requirement. It's just another resource available. Okay, so looking at goals internally as your organization. So maybe you've hit some of those hurdles as staff in the past. Maybe you've tried to get smart salting information out there. Maybe you've tried to encourage people to plant more natives and it's just not taking. Maybe there's just a certain group that is just consistently hard to reach. So looking at those specific measurable time-bound goals, you can always add on. It's hard to scale back, but it's easier to add on. So you can start with a narrower audience and a narrower goal, and then look at how you can build that over time. So, if you're looking at annual activities that exist, again, work smarter, not harder, leverage what you already have. If there's particular events or activities or other educational opportunities that you already have going that maybe are under the environmental umbrella or work with that particular audience, utilize that, absolutely. So some examples are working with homeowner associations in terms of pet waste and yard waste. That's a water quality issue, but it's also a real hassle from anybody who's just trying to walk around the yard. So that can be something that you can really partner with that homeowner association on. Other examples, lake associations with shoreline buffers, as I mentioned earlier, businesses with illicit discharge information or irrigation, multifamily units with smart salting or pet waste, community religious groups with adopted rain, and the list goes on and on. So as you can see, when you start brainstorming, kind of thinking of that specific audience, you think of those behaviors that can be the most impactful for that specific audience and start building your education plan. Okay, so we talked about specific measurable goals. We've talked a lot about the audience and how to set those internal and external goals. And now we want to talk about measurability, right? We've talked a lot about scope. So starting with what you're familiar with or what comes to mind on a particular issue is a good place to start. Is there a particular problem in your community that you're seeing again and again? Are people blowing leaves into the street every fall to get them off of their property? Are people just using a lot of salt on the sidewalks? Every spring you're getting complaints about pet waste at the park, like there's dog poo everywhere. You're most likely getting some of this kind of community information. And think of the best case scenario in terms of these measurable goals. So, what are you building towards basically in terms of these future behaviors and kind of figure out, some steps where you can get to that particular scenario. So some measurable goals here, and you'll notice all of these have numbers. So this again helps you limit that scope, helps you kind of physically define what success is. So maybe you're just looking for 50 interactions, talking, that you can respond or engage with some dispersed materials and, printed materials. Maybe you get 2 shoreline restorations out of lake association engagement. Maybe you have a business that starts a smart irrigation system. Those are huge impact actions. So those are things that you can build on. Maybe you go back to that business the next year and talk to the business association, bring that person along, talk to more people. You know, maybe you do a tour of shoreline restorations in the future. So again, you can start small, you can scale things specifically, and then you can build on those in the future. All right, and then I will give it back to Nick here.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. The last piece is evaluation. And this can be a creative process. Evaluation can be really difficult and a time drain, or it can be streamlined into kind of this golden arrow, like something you were expecting all along, and it's something that's meaningful for the city as a whole. And here's an example for, filling more of these lines in, all hypotheticals. But say we were to take social media with lake associations, we set our goals like Lauren described, and we have our activity schedule, we have our partner coordination, Parks and Rec Department. And then, when you think about how creative this can be, what if the message and the way it's presented caters to the evaluation? So if your message is saying, tell a friend, or like this, if you will tell a friend, you're building in a sense of action into the evaluation. And then you're able to say, well, based on what we know, we have 10 residents who indicated that they would tell a friend, which leads to them acting as an educational leader to their peers. Again, this is in the realm of doing what you can. We don't always have the ability to see the end result and have a really clear full circle that, like, oh yes, we know that this person talked to this person on that day and that gave us our count. That's just not realistic. So, what we have to do as education outreach professionals is we build this in creatively, and we're also honest about, there's some sources of error. We don't really know the impact, but we're designing it in a certain way that says, at least based on what we know, we're able to document the measurable goal. Maybe it's 8 or 9 residents instead of 10, but again, that's the purpose of evaluation, is to say, here's where we fell up short. That's okay. And next time we have something to go off of, and kind of recycle the same thing, and you don't have to start from scratch at that point. And again, like Molly mentioned, resources to use, the sample text factoids that you can find from your watershed. Vlamo has a watershed care calendar. Once a month, there's seasonal tips and tricks that we post on the calendar. That's able to be pulled from and just brought into other communications. That's what we hope for. And the MS4 toolkit. Don't forget about how much is really on that toolkit. If you browse around the website, you'll see templates and sample language. There's enough information there that you could pull out a tidbit of a best practice with something about shorelines, native plants, or yard care, and disperse that into once a month. It's all there for the taking, and sometimes the biggest hurdle is to just get it out into exposure. So that's a way to do that. The resource pool, more about resources. When you think about the events that are happening, a city cleanup day is a big one, happens really regularly. What kind of packet or handout can you give to your captive audience? They're waiting in line and they need to have a check-in. There's there's often something you can give to say that you've reached 200 people easily because there's so many people that come to cleanup day. Volunteer service day. There's often a spring parks cleanup or that kind of thing, whether it's scout troops or congregations, cultural groups. Can you include a storm drain aspect along with a regular trash pickup? Trash pickup is familiar. It's common. It's really embedded into our culture at large. And as we expand that into adopt a drain, a lot of times it's easy to clean out a few storm drains as you're doing trash pickup. So, you know, that's making some connections and advocating for that. Annual scavenger hunts. The city of Vadnais Heights has an annual scavenger hunt, and every year I help the parks manager out, and we do a clue, and it's related to stormwater or a local lake, and boom, that's a creative application that reaches a lot of people who are already doing that scavenger hunt. Lastly, festivals. Those are big and they happen every year. So event promotion can be paired with a link that already exists. It's already something that might be a watershed flyer or a PDF. Can you pair that with event promotion? How to drain swimming pools, grass clippings education, things like that. That's what I mean by the double dipping idea. And the last MS4 measure has a lot of resources on the MS4 toolkit that we want to mention. This is under the MPCA website, under digital document library, and then you will find the templates tab. There's illicit discharge and employee training and facilities inventory template. That's things like how do you store your de-icer in the winter and how are you tracking those. If you're using a template, it's much easier to fill out the SWPPP and pull out those details instead of trying to track down in an email somewhere that was, 3 months ago. So good strategies for good housekeeping. So we will stop the recording now and then go to our question and answer, but thank you for watching. Thanks for attending, and please reach out and talk to us for your planning. If you have questions, things arise, we're excited to dive into these and talk about all the education outreach possibilities we can share. Any last remarks from co-presenters?
No,
Sounds
all set.
good. Yeah. All right. Thank you. That was the stop button, not the stop record button. There we go.